I went to an interesting lecture a couple of nights ago at a local learning center. The topic was the history of written language. It was only an hour, but the guy who taught it went through a very quick bullet point overview, which was fascinating. Reading and writing are things we all take for granted. It's something that we learn to do before we're even fully conscious as humans. Nobody really remembers what it was like before you learned what all these squiggly lines meant and later went through the process of learning how to connect these squiggly lines to abstract ideas up in your brain. But there was once a time when nobody could read or write. Everything we knew had to be remembered and kept up in our brains. The only way to transmit information from one brain to another was to tell somebody something and hope that you were accurate enough and hope that they remembered it enough, or have somebody tell you something and hope that you remembered this enough. The teacher was this Jesuit priest. If you don't know much about the Jesuit order, they were created by the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation. Back when the Catholic Church was very powerful, and the only way to get to heaven was to do what the rulers of the Catholic Church told you what you had to do to get to heaven. Even kings and queens had to be careful not to anger the church because the leaders of the church could excommunicate entire populations. Essentially, the Jesuits were kind of like secret agents who were supposed to travel around the world and find as many converts as possible. They did so outside of the normal organizational structure of the church. This means they had to be extremely well educated and learn all kinds of languages and local customs and cultures. They had essentially the equivalent of several doctoral degrees. After the lecture, we went out drinking, and this guy knocked back quite a few glasses of wine. Pretty soon, he was pretty drunk and telling us all kinds of stories. When the first people invented written language, they mainly did so to keep track of how much stuff the rulers owned and how much people owed in taxes. Only after that stuff was figured out did they realize just how powerful written language is, how easily it could be used to slowly shape the narrative of the overarching stories that ruled society. Think of way back before writing was invented. No science, only basic knowledge about agriculture. Everything had to be remembered. People that could remember a lot, people that could hold a lot of ideas in your mind could become very powerful. They could easily tell and retell the stories that essentially shaped society, the origins of society, the deities and how they interacted with people. Examples of behavior by the people that had won the favor of the gods of the past. Examples of behavior by the people who had angered the gods of the past and the horrible things that had happened to them. This must have given those rare people who could remember and tell stories an incredible amount of power. This all changed when they invented writing, since writing was invented by the rulers to keep track of all their wealth. This allowed rulers to slowly shape the narrative that controlled society, the narrative from which they drew their laws, the narrative that made the rulers start to be treated like gods. If you had no idea what writing was or how it worked, some guy who could stand up and tell endless stories would be a magician, and the guy who he served would have been a god. He said this is how all societies are run, even to this day. The people who control the narrative of any society are the ones who rule society, the ones who define what's right and wrong, the one who define who the heroes are and who the villains are. He said this is why the CIA has long had control of the American media, going all the way back to their inception shortly after World War II. By the end of the night, this guy was way in the tank. He wasn't quite slurring his words, but he was going on and on about the corruption in society, corruption in the church, devil worship in the church, devil worship in society, human sacrifice in the church, human sacrifice in society at the high levels. I got the idea that he thought maybe he should have risen much higher in the ranks than he did of the Jesuit order. Maybe he thought he should have had more power than he does. He wasn't really bitter, and maybe he was being honest about how much corruption there was, but he did make a lot of very good points. Of course, the Phoenicians are the ones who created the first alphabet. Those two words, Phoenicians and alphabet, are very old. The word phone from Phoenicians is in every word that describes the sound. Telephone, phonetics, phoneme. All have the word phone, which comes from Phoenicians, who invented the first language. Alphabet, which comes from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. The Greeks took the basic writing system from the Phoenicians and added vowels to it, which is essentially the basics of most modern writing systems. Then you have hieroglyphics. The Phoenicians invented a writing system to represent sounds without meaning. The other kind are symbols to represent ideas which can have different sounds. According to some scholars, the first record of written symbols of ideas are found written on bones in ancient China. It's believed they were used to send messages back and forth to the spirit world so that they could talk to the dead. I really like the Learning Center. Sometimes they have these hidden gems like this one. Other times they have meditation classes and other things that people find this interesting.